webinars. Yeah, sorry. I hope I don't have too many of those interruptions.
Grace, just let me know when you think we should get going.
Oh, my RA did make it. Thank goodness.
Great. Well, I think I'm going to get started because I have a little bit of an introduction here before so Grace, don't worry about it. I'll just get started. Welcome everyone to our 9th week of this quarter, 8th or 9th week of the quarter. That's what I think, it's the 8th week. Thank you for being here. Glad you could be here. This is CSDE's. I have a few things to announce, and then I'll announce our speaker. As you may know, I'm Sarah Curran, the director of the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. And welcome everyone to the Center's Friday lecture series. Before we begin, I want to share 2 sets of acknowledgements. First, our land acknowledgement. CSDE acknowledges we are located on the Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations and other Native peoples. This land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with Coast Salish lands, waters, people, and other non-human kin. CSDE's commissioned logo from Native artist UW professor Marvin Oliver acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. Second, I want to acknowledge our funding. CSD is extremely grateful for support from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, the School of Public Health, the School of Social Work, the Business School, the Population Health Initiative, the eScience Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research. Before I turn to my introduction of our speaker, I just want to remind everybody that the webinar is fully virtual, as you know, and in order to share and ask questions, we ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom box. Sending things to through chat doesn't always get distributed to everybody. And it's better to use a Q&A because we can all see it. So without further ado, I want to just welcome one of our newest CSDE affiliates, Professor Mike Spencer, who is a UW Presidential Term Professor in Social Work and the Director of Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Oceanic Affairs at the University of Washington's Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. He is an alum of the University of Washington with a PhD in social welfare. And prior to coming back to UW, he served as a professor of social work and associate dean for educational programs at the University of Michigan. He is also a native Hawaiian descent and is a graduate of the Kamehameha schools. His research examines health and wellness among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders and is focused on interventions that promote health among Native Hawaiians through indigenous practices and values. Currently, his research examines the added benefit of integrating Native Hawaiian healers into primary care in Oahu. He also works with colleagues at the University of Hawaii to promote food security and well-being through the use of backyard aquaponics systems. So really interesting, diverse array of research, and we're looking forward to hearing about his particular findings with regards to COVID and its impacts among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. Welcome, Mike. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And before I begin, I'm going to apologize. I'm going to start off by apologizing because I'm working from home and I have two little doggies in my home, and every now and then they go nuts. So if they start going nuts while I'm in the talk, I apologize. I might mute for a quick second, but I'll then come back on. Okay. So let me just start off by saying thank you so much, Sarah, and to CSDE for inviting me to this seminar to share my work. You know, as you heard, a lot of my work focused really on more practical interventions that exist within the community. A lot of my work is founded upon community-based participatory research principles. And a lot of my work, at least the work that I was doing, was largely on the island of Oahu in the state of Hawaii. But then, as we all know, you know, we had a pandemic interrupt a lot of our lives and our research. And you know, there was a moment that we had to decide whether or not, you know, we would pivot or you know, maybe take some time off or do something else. And we decided that it was important to pivot and to look at what was going on with our community as COVID was impacting all of us. So let me just start by giving you a little bit of orientation into what we're talking about. So Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, for the purposes of this talk, we're going to use the term Pacifica. This was a term agreed upon by our community partners, and it's a little less wordy than Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. It's actually a term that's used quite a bit throughout the Pacific Islands, less common here on the continent, but it's a term that's often used. Who are Pacifica? So as you can see, we represent a vast and variety of people and places. Pacifica are considered the indigenous people of the Pacific Islands. We consist of Polynesians, Micronesians, Melanesians, and as you can see, representing many different groups. I want to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about how we got to where we are, a little bit of history, a little bit of setting the table for the work with COVID. So prior to, you know, our work with COVID, we had been doing a lot of work with Pacifica communities, and particularly our interests were in health inequities. Why are we interested in these? Well, first of all, there are a great number of health inequities among Pacifica populations in terms of cancer rates, in terms of diabetes, in terms of obesity, as well as a number of other chronic illnesses. And where do all of these things stem from? Well, they stem from a long history of structural racism, settler colonialism, diasporas, and various forms of trauma. But we also are quite a resilient group of people. We've survived quite a bit of historical trauma. We've survived a lot of invisibility and a lot of erasure of our people. Several sort of large concepts that I want to talk about that have impacted our well-being. The first being settler colonialism, which is the replacement or elimination of indigenous people and cultures with an invasive settler society. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but those can range from anywhere from violent depopulation to assimilation. Militarism looks at the synergistic relationship between U.S. military expansion, which, you know, a lot of people think of World War II as the point at which the U.S. expansion into the Pacific began, but it began way before then. And in Hawaii, particularly, you know, 1998, and in the Pacific, that represents a very important year. because so many things happened around that time. Hawaii being annexed, the Spanish-American War, and the acquisition of Guam, as well as in 1899, the Second Civil War in Samoa, in which the US and Germans divided up Samoa, and the British acquired the Solomon Islands. We also, as you probably already know, there's a whole lot of history of military in the Pacific, and it's probably as occupied as anywhere else in the world right now. A lot of tests have been done in our islands. It's actually still being done. A lot of bombings, testing of nuclear weaponry. The bomb that you see here to the right is an explosion of a nuclear bomb that was over Bikini Atoll, which is in the Federated States of Micronesia. There's also, if you look at the Zoom background that is behind me here, this is actually in the state of Hawaii on the island of Kaho'olawe, which is right off the shore of Maui and Lanai, if any of you have been to those islands. It's currently uninhabited. It's uninhabitable because the water table had been cracked by a 500 megaton bomb that was used to simulate a nuclear explosion. So, these kinds of exercises have occurred throughout the Pacific Islands. And finally, the idea of racial capitalism or the extraction the extraction of social and economic value from people of different racial identities, typically people of color, and the use of non-white people in lands to acquire social and economic value. I'll give you some examples of these in a minute. Just to take a little bit off of a run off of Eve Tuck's work here on the definition of settler colonialism. It's a structural system. It's not a singular event in history. Settler colonialism denies existence of indigenous people and the legitimate claims to their land, which is actually something that continues to happen today, including the recognition of us even as indigenous people. Aims to vanquish indigenous people and replace them with settlers, and that the logic of elimination requires not just the removal of people by any means necessary, but also myriad forms of assimilation. And as some of the examples here demonstrate, these are things that have occurred not only within our continent here in North America, but throughout the Pacific as well. So I just want to give you a little bit of a little quiz just to kind of give you a sense of what settler colonialism, what it means. So the pineapple, right? Pineapple is something that, everyone comes to Hawaii and they need to go see the pineapples and take a few pineapples home. Pineapples are not indigenous to Hawaii. Pineapples are actually a plantation crop that was brought in as a form of capitalism. The ukulele. Hawaiians have mastered the ukulele, but we did not invent the ukulele. Ukulele was brought to Hawaii by Portuguese immigrants who came to work in our sugarcane fields. Another thing that tourists love to take home from Hawaii is the macadamia nut. Even named after one of our sacred mountains, Mauna Loa, and seasoned with Maui onions, which are also not indigenous to Hawaii, by the way. Macadamia nuts are indigenous to New Zealand and not Hawaii. Finally, the sandy beaches of Waikiki, where many of you, if you visited Waikiki, probably sat on or laid out in the sun on. That's the history of Waikiki is that it was originally a swampland. It was marshlands, and it was filled in order to build a resort. The sand was brought in from Manhattan Beach, California, and the sand continues to need to be brought in because of erosion. So if you laid on the sands of Waikiki Beach, you actually laid on the sands of California. So that just gives you a little sense of what we talk when we talk about erasure and invisibility of a culture and the replacement of another culture. And in this case, a tourist culture. You know, we use that as an excellent example of settler colonialism. Just to give you a little bit more insight into the Native Hawaiian experience, I'm focusing on Native Hawaiians because I'm Native Hawaiian myself, and I don't feel it's appropriate for me to necessarily talk about the narratives of other populations. So I'm going to stick to my own group to give you a little bit of our history. When we talk about depopulation, for example, prior to the arrival of Captain Cook, it was estimated that we had anywhere between 500,000 people to 7,500,000 people on the islands. And this was as estimated by Captain Cook's crew. By 1784, there were approximately 142,000. And then by the first census, there was only 39,000 Native Hawaiians. Today, our numbers are back up. But a lot of this was, this initial depopulation was due to, well, guns, germs, and steel, warfare, pestilence, and disease. I don't have time to go into a lot of the details on this, so you know, if we can always talk later. The second, again, colonization, just some various forms of colonization. One, the depossession of land through the concept of land ownership. Owning land was not a value within Native Hawaiian culture, and in fact, we had quite a different relationship with land. So this introduced a new type of relationship with land. Other forms of trade soon followed, including sandalwood, whaling. I had mentioned pineapple and sugarcane. What many people don't know is many of the waters that flow from the mountains, the springs on top of our mountains and flow into the ocean, into the sea. Many of those waters were historically diverted away from Native Hawaiian communities and taken to not just residential areas, but to water pineapple, sugarcane, golf courses, resorts, and other places, leaving what was formerly very lush and fertile lands into essentially dry forests. Christianity, another form of colonization, which replaced our spirituality and our culture. Today, if you want to read about Native Hawaiian spirituality, you know, you probably would go to a book on mythology. So, you know, our spirituality has now become mythology or a thing of the past. Ethnocide, the eradication of our language in 1896. Our languages were not only banned from our schools, but we were also banned from our cultural practices like our dance, our hula, our medicines. When they reemerged, they oftentimes reemerged in the form of tourism. So hula, a lot of the hula that you know today, we call awana or modern hula. Our ancient hula consists primarily of chant and drum, as opposed to ukuleles and guitars. So just a little bit about our communities pre-pandemic. Excuse me. So we were not doing so well prior to the pandemic, as you might be able to guess from some of this data here. In fact, there was quite a bit of poverty compared to non-Hispanic whites, and unemployment was rather high in comparison as well to non-Hispanic whites. In King County, we see that about 23% of Pacifica lived 200% below the poverty line, and that that was significantly higher than that of Asians and whites. Pacifica are more likely to live in multi-generational households, which also can be a risk for contracting COVID-19. Some other challenges that exist within our Pacifica communities is the diversity of citizenship. And you see on the right here, just a few examples of the ways in which the peoples of the Pacific differ, not only in their citizenship, their migration status, languages, which probably number in the thousands, as well as distinct cultures. And then finally, what has sort of plagued research with Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians for years and years and years is the aggregation of our communities with Asian Americans. And so oftentimes the Asian Pacific Islander racial category is used, which really does an injustice in terms of our own ability to look at our own data. Oftentimes our groups are so small because we were not targeted for data collection. And we seem as though we're doing a little bit better than perhaps we are because of our aggregation with Asian Americans. This even goes beyond that, though. I mean, the aggregation of Pacifica actually is also quite problematic, as well, as we are not a monolithic group. And so these are just some of the barriers to the work that we do with Pacifica and trying to find good data. So now we move into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we see is that, because our communities have had long experiences with health, economic, and social inequities, we see that the burden of COVID-19 could potentially exacerbate these inequities even further. And so we decided that we really wanted to examine some of these things. Some of the data, the evidence that shows that in the US, if you look at mortality for Pacifica from COVID-19, that it was significantly higher than that for whites. Similar to those rates for Latinos and for Blacks and Native Americans. Pacifica also have the highest rates of COVID-19 deaths in 3 states, in Hawaii, California, and Utah, where we have some of the largest populations. Pacifica, living in the state of Washington, had the highest per capita case rates, as well as death rates from COVID-19 in comparison to all other ethnic groups. So in the state of Washington, our community has not been doing so well. And there's also reports that approximately 24% of Pacifica also work in essential jobs. And so these risk factors sort of led us to start to look at what data was out there that was available for us to examine social and economic hardships within the Pacifica community that might be exacerbated by pre-existing hardships. And so I want to give props here to my doctoral student, Tino Camacho, who I believe is in the group here, and he will be available if there's any real technical questions. I hope there's not too many highly technical questions, but he will be available, and we can also spend some time and share with you some of the details, because I won't have time to get into all the details here. But we embarked on a mixed method study. We wanted to not just look at secondary data, but we also wanted to collect our own data. And we did that through focus groups with 5 different Pacific Island communities. This work was guided by participatory research principles and guided by our community advisory board, as well as our community partner, the Pacific Islander Community Association of Washington. And finally, the project was funded by the Population Health COVID Rapid Response Grant Program. I'm just going to go through the methods very quickly. We used a couple of different data sets. One that you probably are aware, many of you probably are already aware of, which is the current population survey, or the CPS, the IPUMS CPS, which is Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US Census. For the state of Washington, and particularly for our King County analysis, we use data from the Office of Fiscal Management and the Washington Employment Security Department. For our CPS data, we looked at racial differences in sort of three categories of employment status, whether or not people were able to be paid for work from home, and also the industry telework friendliness. We use Washington data to look at unemployment claims. For the CPS data, we actually drew a sample from the 10 most populous states that had Pacifica in them. Part of the reason we did that was when we used the entire national data set, our numbers compared to everyone else was so small that we wanted to do a slightly more focused analysis where we just looked at those states where we were where we had the biggest numbers, in order to try and get as much power as we can for this study. Our models all controlled for age, time, education, as well as geography, which we looked at by Hawaii and non-Hawaii because of the great number of people that Pacifica that actually do live in Hawaii in the US. Some of the results that we found, well, interestingly enough, we did not see we didn't see any significant differences in unemployment from Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and American Indian Alaska Natives. There was a marginally significant relationship compared to whites, where we had higher unemployment rates than whites. Nationally, Pacifica did have a greater odds of paid work from home opportunities, except for Asian Americans, which was kind of an interesting finding, but also further evidence around why we might need to disaggregate data. If this seems a bit of an unusual finding, it wasn't an anticipated finding, but one of the things that we noted is that this was only measured for those employed, and that probably explains some of that as well. Pacifica also had a lower odds of working in a tele-friendly industry as compared to whites, Blacks, and Native Americans. And then finally, in Washington counties with the highest Pacifica concentrations, and we looked specifically at King, Pierce, Snohomish, Clark, Spokane, Kitsap, and Thurston, that unemployment claims were actually higher compared to all other racial groups, and they were significantly higher than whites and Asians. Just to show you a little bit of the data from the Washington State unemployment claims, we looked at first initial incidence rates, and you can see that the ratio for Pacifica compared to whites and compared to Asians are quite high. So just a little bit about the implications of this data here. Basically, not only does it demonstrate the complexity of understanding this, but it also, and the complexity of the data itself, and even acquiring data was so very difficult. But they do correspond with national reports of marginalized communities being impacted by unemployment. And this includes Pacifica populations. And although there was only marginal significance at the national level, that we can see this as, we have a number of different explanations for this, including the fact that many of our people work in essential industries, and therefore unemployment might be less of an issue. One of the public health or the health equity implications that we derived was the need for continued advocacy to support data disaggregation, so that we can analyze our own data and have more control of our own lives, which is congruent with the concept of data sovereignty. In terms of the focus groups, so again, we had 5 focus groups with about 5 to 7 participants, or a total of 34 individuals. We're still in the process of analyzing this data here, but just to give you a little sense of who were the participants here. Um, Basically, they were members of the community who were recruited by our community partner. Um, so many of them were either known members within the community, leaders within the community, or people who are accessing services through the PICOA organization. So we not only asked people about the challenges that they experienced through the pandemic, particularly around economic hardship, but also some of the strengths that they observed in the community as well. And here's just a few of the major themes that we're seeing emerge. First of all, just the difficulties of navigating social services, unemployment claims, and other COVID-related aid. Why? Due to various forms of inaccessibility, language differences, technological barriers, as well as their immigration and citizenship status. Uh, Economic hardship and food security was also a very common theme, where people not only experience unemployment, but I think in more cases a reduced number of hours, furloughs, or that type of thing, that not only affects their income, but it affects their livelihood and their everyday lives. For example, um, mothers becoming primary bread owners when fathers may have been primary bread owners, various new structures for childcare and such. Um, Many talked about the use of food banks, donations, food distribution, um, as well as the impact on youth. Many of them felt as though there was a need for the community to really sort of, build a buffer around our youth, because many of our youth have not only lost their motivation to perhaps continue in school, to get on a Zoom classroom, but they've also lost a lot of their peer connections. And I worked on another study looking at the impact of COVID on school age children, and we see this same type of worry or concern that children are going to be impacted long term by the pandemic because of their lost connections and their inability to maintain their educational aspirations. Impact on mental health. We're seeing this with everybody, but within our community, people's talked about the inability to socialize and access their culture through the process of socializing. And then finally, the difficulties or the importance of maintaining cultural connections. Many people talked about this notion of providing mutual aid to their community as a community value. Just a couple of quotes real quickly here. Navigating services for aid. This is a story about a woman who describes her brother-in-law who had a COVID scare. He didn't want to get tested because he doesn't have insurance, because he was born in the Marshall Islands. He doesn't know where to get insurance. He doesn't feel like he even qualifies for insurance. And when he tried to apply for through work, that process was taking a while, because all of a sudden, all the Marshallese people wanted to get insurance, well, because they also had COVID scares. So another quote around economic hardship. So with my family, I would probably say that it was me who was the breadwinner at the time. My husband was on furlough from the hospital, and I had left working at the hospital because of COVID. And since we have 3 children and we were living paycheck to paycheck at that point, thankfully, we have where we live. We have a strong church family, and we go to our bishop, and they help us with monetary value. And this is just a few photos of our community during the pandemic. As you can see, there were, organizations, community organizations were involved not only in food distribution, they're involved in in getting out information, accurate information in multiple Pacific Island languages. They were available for testing, they were available for vaccines and various forms of protective care like masks. So it was an incredible community response, and one of the things that I do want to say is, although much of the data that I'm presenting perhaps casts a dark shadow on our community, that this photo here is so important because it exemplifies the strengths of our community and our resilience and our resolve. Now, the last data I want to talk to you about is from national needs assessment that was recently completed. Well, actually, it was completed last year by folks here at our Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. While it was a sample of Native Americans, a sample of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders were also included in this national needs assessment. It was a cross-sectional online survey. It targeted, the sampling was quite complex, utilized multiple methods. One, we targeted community-based networks, and we used their networks to form the basis of our samples. And we also used quota sampling through a Qualtrics panel. And we also did our best to stratify our sampling by region, 4 regions within the US, as well as by gender. You can see a little bit of the demographics of the people who participated in our survey. And lastly, it was only in English. So that was also another limitation of this survey. To give you a sense, so there are over 10,000 respondents to the entire survey. About 1,800 were Pacifica. As you can see, the majority of those individuals were from the continental US as opposed to Hawaii. We did not have strong participation there, and that may have been due to some of our some partnerships that could probably be improved. Of that sample, as you can see, the majority of that sample were Native Hawaiian. Other Pacific Islanders consisted of about 490, with Chamorro, Samoan, and Marshallese being the largest groups. Mean age, about 36. As you can see, we did a pretty good job with the gender, as there's almost as many men as females. Median income, education, many had less than the majority had less than a college degree. And in this sample, actually, you remember I had mentioned to you about it was estimated 24% were essential workers. Well, in this sample, 46.8% identified as essential workers. When we look at employment status in our survey, one of the things that you will notice is that while unemployment seems to be quite low, and I think a lot of that is being driven by Polynesians on the continental US as opposed to in Hawaii, you really see employed part-time, those numbers being really, really high. And so, this is consistent with some of the data that we saw previously on lost income, furloughs, income loss due to jobs going from full-time to going to part-time, layoffs, these kinds of things affecting employment, at least full-time employment. We also looked at pandemic-related job or income loss as well. And again, you can see that there was a very high number of individuals who lost income or lost their job specifically related to the pandemic. In terms of food security and economic hardship, about 44% said they were moderately or extremely worried about affording or accessing food in the last 2 weeks. And an additional 45% were a little worried. So, this is the kind of thing that really concerns us. Measure of food security within the past 7 days shows that about 28% sometimes or often did not have enough to eat. About 14% accessed the food bank or food pantry within the past 7 days. Within the past 7 days, about 11.5% reported rationing or skipping meals. In terms of the greatest help that people felt that they could receive during the pandemic, these are some of the areas, as you can see, quite vital areas: housing, employment services, health services, unemployment services, transportation, and internet access. In terms of vaccinations, we have about, at this time in March 2021, so quite a bit over a year ago, only 12% had been vaccinated. We're not too surprised by that numbers because vaccines hadn't been made as widely available yet. But it is still concerning because when we ask people about how likely they were to be vaccinated, as you can see, we have quite a number of people who are either very unlikely or somewhat unlikely, and then a whole group of people who are unsure. And then there's actually a large number of missing data, and you can only assume that those people who are missing probably fall along the unsure lines because we don't have a lot of missing data on a lot of other variables to that degree. In terms of some of the greatest motivating factors for getting vaccinated, number one, to protect their elders, and two, to protect their family members. And then three, the greatest factor affecting trust in terms of the vaccine. You know, I was a little surprised that people said backed by science, but I'm glad they said that. Family doctor recommendation, I'm a little surprised, but I'm glad they said that as well. The one that, you know, I think I would have thought was number one was trusted family member recommendation, but that ends up being number three, which is still quite high. Strategies for coping with stress. You know, I mean, these are some of the things that I thought were so beautiful. Listening to music, singing, playing instruments. Pacific people are so talented with regard to music. Oftentimes, you know, we often are singing and playing instruments, oftentimes from birth. So that doesn't surprise me too much. Some of the other things, maybe more concerning or less concerning, exercising, working out, talking to health and mental health professionals, great. Increase in television and screen time. Social media doesn't surprise me either because that's where how people get connected. Spiritual and cultural coping strategies. You know, our Pacifica community is oftentimes quite a religious community, a very spiritual community, and so, you know, two of the top responses to this in terms of in terms of coping strategies was praying for family and friends impacted by COVID, and praying for spiritual support to get through the pandemic. And then lastly, the third biggest area was worried about the loss of our traditional knowledge keepers or our elders. And I'm going to end with this slide here, which is a framework for Native Hawaiian wellness that was developed by a group, a collective group. We call this Kukulu Kumuhana. I was a part of this group that developed this framework here. And it consists of these various values that exist within our Hawaiian community. And I use this as sort of a way to summarize a lot of the work that, a lot of the values that you've seen throughout this research. So the idea of self-determination or having control over our lives, I see AI as a form of our call for data sovereignty and disaggregation of data. Aina Momona, healthy lands, healthy people, life in balance with nature. This is in opposition to settler colonialism and the destruction of our lands and our people. Pilina, quality relationships, giving support to one another. The value of relationships, our relational well-being is as important as our physical and psychological well-being. Vai, shared wealth, seeing value in everyday things. Oiwi, our cultural identity, knowing who we are, knowing where we came from. And lastly, Keakua Mana, spirituality or belief in a higher power. And all of these things are also characterized through our contemporary resolve of over 100, 200 years of settler colonial oppression. And with that, I will, oh, I'm sorry, one more slide, just a quick one. Consider the impact of, so just some implications for research, considering the impact of history, as well as contemporary issues, and not to just look at Indigenous people as things of the past, but things of the present and things of the future. The need for data that disaggregates so that we can have large enough samples, and the need for different kinds of sampling strategies that allow us to do this. And respondent-driven sampling seems to show some promise in that area. Capacity building for Pacific communities to be able to address their own needs and to conduct their own research. And then finally, collaborating with communities and creating new systems as necessary. You know, when systems of power do not serve our communities, then we need to find ways to create new systems to serve our people. And that's what you see in a lot of the mutual aid that we've talked about. And finally, just a picture from Mauna Kea, our sacred mountain, where there's been years of protests of the TMT, or the 30 meter telescope. It's a note from our people to say, Momoa, Aku, Imua, move forward with determination, or onward. Mahalo, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. I thought maybe one thing I could do while people are absorbing and thinking about a question or two is I'm going to ask Tino to join our, to see his picture and ask him to join our conversation, if that's okay. I'm going to promote him to panelist here. Hopefully that will work. Yes, he's going to join as a panelist, and there we go. Good. So Tino, you can you can make yourself visible if you want, just to say hi. Good. Yeah, the floor is open. Where are you going to go next with this work, Mike? Let's Mike and Tino.
Well, I think everyone's so tired of doing COVID work that it's, I'm having a hard time finding some people to get motivated to work on the data. And I think that probably is a good thing. I mean, that probably shows that, we may be moving out of maybe the most difficult period of time. But I think that, we owe it to our community to get this data out and into, to disseminate it publicly. And not just sit on it. The data was collected as part of the congressional caucuses. So we also have an ear to DC in terms of potential implications that we might have. And also too, I think for us, a lot of this work, because I'm new to the state of Washington and new to the community here, it was really an opportunity for me to engage with our community, to engage them in research. And I'm hopeful that moving forward from here, that we'll continue to be able to do community-based participatory research within the community.
Nice. Yeah. Jenny Romick has her hand up, and I've allowed her to talk. I'm hoping that works. I can also promote her to panelist first. But there she goes.
Okay. First of all, Mike, that was great, and I'm just thrilled to see you, and it's fun to see what Tino has been doing too. So first, appreciation. And now in academic fashion, a self-interested question. I have been working with state administrative data and thinking through its potential for providing data disaggregation, because we get full populations rather than samples. But that data comes from interactions with the state. So interactions with DSHS as people go to apply for food assistance or other types of assistance, what you record on birth certificates when you have a kid and things like that. What's your sense of how well those institutions do in terms of collecting appropriate identity information and what would be best practice there from your perspective? So I'll go mute now because I've got some other noise in the background too.
Thanks, Jenny.
You want to try and answer that, Tino?
Yeah, and excuse the noise in the background that might happen. I'm printing flyers for the undergraduate research symposium. So I guess a good answer to your question, Jenny, is that every state does it differently. And I actually am not familiar too deeply with sort of state administrative data and sort of how they collect race and ethnicity, but I think if it disaggregates down based on sort of like different subpopulations, that makes the data better. And this is just kind of speaking to sort of the vast diversity that Mike had mentioned earlier around different NHPI communities. And I think I've also brought this up in one of your classes, but you know, like there's different even like immigration statuses between different communities and sort of like different definitions of indigeneity depending on which islands folks come from. And all those, and sort of the role of sort of defining citizenship in relation to those things, I think also challenges both sort of like administrative data, but also welfare policy.
You know, one thing that I'll just add to that is where we had a little bit more traction and a little bit more support was with King County itself. So working more at the county level, there's some excellent people there. We work with Marguerite Rowe, as some of you may know Marguerite, at King County. You know, they were, I think that here's the issue. They have good data. They have some disaggregated data. But even when they have disaggregated data, sometimes those ends become so small for the groups that we're interested in that they're not able to release that data to us because of confidentiality or because it wouldn't be very useful to us. So, you know, we need a strategy where we're sampling adequate numbers in these cells, you know, and that's where, you know, I had mentioned, you know, respondent driven sampling as a potential possibility. And I was actually working with we didn't get funded on this grant, but we were looking at a grant to do some respondent driven sampling with Native Hawaiian Pacific Island communities. We didn't get funded on that project, but we'll keep trying. That may be a good way for us to be able to fill those cells better.
That's interesting. Mike, I might mention that we've got a few people in doing statistical demography that would probably be quite interested in that, in those techniques anyway. And they've developed them, sort of network sampling or respondent driven sampling and the like. So I'm happy to, or Jessica Godwin, who's also on the call, can also help with that. So
excellent. Yeah,
that sounds very exciting. I've brought onto the panel Kalfani Mwamba, who has a question. He's coming on. There he is. The question in the chat was, what's core or essential information that must reach students with regards to Pacifica? And but I know he's coming on, so maybe he can say it better than I just said it here.
So thanks you. Thanks so much. Just with all due respect, just all props and all respect to the data. Two things occur to me. One is the question about core information getting to students about Pacifica. This is a new term for me. I'm very excited about what in the Black Freedom Movement we refer to as Kujichagulia or self-determination, and this notion that this renaming of Pacifica, that I'm fascinated about that, and I'm wondering what core information about Pacifica must reach students. I'm also impressed with what I perceive as your conversion of pain into power. And I'm curious about anything you would share in that regard, just how you manage. I mean, obviously, you're very effectively kind of embodying an exemplar of that management of conversion, pain into power, and any words of inspiration that you would share in that regard also. So there's two issues: pain to power, and then core information to students about Pacifica. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kalfani.
Thank you, Kalfani. Core information, I'll start with that because I think the biggest issue for us is invisibility. I mean, I really do think that most people don't even know the history of the places that they're visiting, for vacation or for resort life. I think just a general sense of, and that, I mean, that is settler colonialism, right? I mean, that embodies settler colonialism right there, and it also embodies this notion of white supremacy that, that people can come and enjoy lands, and have a nice time and not have to think about whose land you're standing on, who's, who your servers are and what they're doing to survive in life. It's invisible because there's a tourism culture, there's a culture that's been created to make us look like we're happy, we're doing well, we're here for your enjoyment and your pleasure. And that's not the original instructions we were given. And so I think for me, that's core and essential. And then, as with other racialized groups, Kalfani, I mean, because of the number of challenges that our community already faces as a result of structural racism and settler colonialism, things like, events like a pandemic can impact our group in perhaps greater ways, in different ways, and to not think about even the pandemic experience as a monolithic experience, that we're all experiencing the same thing, because we all are not, and we can even look at simply by something like gender, right, between men and women during this pandemic, and we look at gender by academics, and we can see that, boy, the pandemic had a very different effect on people based along just that line alone. So if we think about it, and we're a pretty privileged group, I mean, can you imagine the trials and tribulations of people who historically have experienced hardship?
Thanks, Mike. I shared in the chat for undergraduates, there's a Oceania and Pacific Islander minor at the University of Washington housed in American Indian Studies, and offers excellent courses for learning a little bit more, although I hadn't heard the term Pacifica either, so I was glad to learn about it from you, Mike. We have any other questions, comments, reactions?
I think I wanted to add something maybe to what Mike said about what students should know towards Kalfani's question. And I think one really important thing that irks me a lot in courses is this disassociation with territories and sort of like welfare, health, public health, all the things around sort of like how territorial status impacts the health and wellness of communities in territories. And it's, it's a weird microaggression that happens in the classroom that I think is not well understood by academics and often gets brushed off in comments like, oh, well, we're focusing primarily on like US policy. Well, it's like, correct, but territories are still on the border of sort of like, on the edge of US imperialism, right? So, they're still under the sort of discourse of within the US and should be considered, especially for students who are coming from those areas, who are coming, to the continental US to learn and bring back skills to their communities in the territories. So.
Yeah.
I was responding to a question in the chat about
Oh.
ethical tourism, and yes, there is ethical tourism, and in fact, a lot of folks go with the intention not only of learning about history and learning about culture, but also giving back to community, engaging in community service and things of that nature. And there's some community and some community groups that actually host individuals to do programs and projects like community service on the trips. But it's a growing industry, but it's a small industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Majority of tourism is still very exploitative.
Yeah.
I always view tourism as like COVID, like you do a risk assessment and then you decide what your ethics are in approaching, you have COVID, you're going to go outside. Like nothing is necessarily stopping you in this day and age, but it's up to your own personal ethics and whether or not you're going to go there. So when a community tells you not to come, for example, because they're having a water crisis, then you shouldn't participate in tourism that is out of that community's control. So I think that's my response to ethical tourism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and I know at least for Native Hawaiian people, we're very welcoming people. We don't want to say don't come, or don't visit, or you can't come enjoy our land. But I mean, there comes a point in time where the life of the land is as important as the people. Well, they're one and the same. The life of the land and the people are one and the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you'll come back in a year or two when you've got a little more under your belt and want to share more. We'd love to hear more about it. I think there's a great deal of interest. As you noted, there's a fairly large community of Pacifica people in the Northwest. And not only that, there are longstanding ties. I was part of setting up this minor on the Oceania and Pacific Islander minor. And one of the motivations was the fact that the Northwest Native communities have had long-standing relationships that stretch back. So the idea of the boundary of, the U.S. boundary at the coast is really not relevant given the relationships that extend across the boundary and across that space.
Yeah, they were actually Hawaiians on the ship that Vancouver sailed into the Puget Sound.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're getting wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Congratulations on the work, and thank you for making this contribution for our community.
Thank you.